Good afternoon. All right, everybody, thank you so much. There's still a few seats. All right, so we have a jam-packed afternoon for you, and we're going to try various experiments with speaking for varying amounts of time and having conversations, technological media, and so on. So the order this afternoon is Mel Chen, Jean Vaccaro, Paul Preciado will join us by Skype, and then we're going to move into a performance piece at the end with Boy Child. I'm really excited, following on from Karen Barad's contribution on quantum field theory and the deconstructed nature of reality. I think it's very fitting to move next to Mel Chen's work. Mel Chen is Associate Professor of Gender and Women's Studies at UC Berkeley. They're also the Director of the Center for the Study of Sexual Culture. And they have many different and often incompatible, in the way that we've set up disciplines, areas of interest that include queer and gender studies, but also animal studies, critical race theory, Asian American studies, disability studies, environmental humanities, the study of toxicity, and so on. And this is part of what his work contests, is the discrete parceling out of knowledge in ways that makes it impossible to think certain concepts. And I'm deeply influenced by and admiring of Mel Chen's first book, which explored questions of racialization, queering, disability, and the affective economies in animate and inanimate life through this extended consideration of what came up in Karen Barad's talk as animacy. Okay, so we're going to think today further along the chain of animacies towards what Mel is calling agitation. Good to know is that Mel Chen is a linguist by training, and I'm not sure that there were many people who came to queer theory from linguistics before Mel. And his chapter on the performative utterance in animacies is stunning for the linguistic insights that it brings to thinking about speech as a performative act. He is an absolutely unclassifiable theorist of the able-disabled body, race, and toxicity. I'm extremely excited to introduce him, and he will be talking today about agitation as a form of conduct. Mel Chen.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Jack, for just your amazing collegiality through these years. You're consistently a wonderful interlocutor. You've inspired my work, and so just thank you for bringing me here. Thank you all for being here. Thank you so much to our previous speakers, which we had a chance to catch some of yesterday. Thanks to Rizvana for an amazing act of curation yesterday. Thanks to our brilliant previous speakers and to the future speakers and dancers for today. I am getting sick very quickly. My throat is killing me. I mean, not literally, but I'm one of, I guess, the people who might say, don't touch me, since I don't want you to get whatever this is that I have. Okay. What acts, movements, gestures comprise an embodied archive of political agitation? What other forms and modes of embodiment that can be counted? What might it mean to focus on the embodiment of agitation as a form of living presence, and without prioritizing moral judgment as to its provenance or intention, rather than on the strategies used to kill it? And finally, what might it mean to consider the encoding of agitation as politically threatening precisely because it could be an urgent transspatial way to hold me now, maybe a holding without necessarily touching, a vibration? These are admittedly enormous questions, but I wish to sketch out a broad range of imaginative possibility. So the talk considers the possibilities of an embodied archive of political agitation through an expanded notion of gesture, and it's part of a larger project in which I'm exploring questions of slowness and agitation, chemical intimacies, including intoxications, and the biopolitics of race and disability. So today, I'm weaving a set of, I think, maybe less frequently attested relations in productive comparison. The political gestures of resistance, the embodiment of disability, the expansion of medicalization and of discourses of security in a time of crisis, and racial gesture. To do so, I'll visit Bergson's short work, Laughter, to probe at its ambivalent questions of comedy, reliant on the machinic, on the fresh impression, and on particular temporalities of being versus expression. And I should mention that it's drawn from a piece that will appear in Jack Halberstam and Tavia Nyango's South Atlantic quarterly special issue on wildness, which I was honored to participate in. And I also want to thank Julia, who was a critical reader for that paper. Wait, I need to turn the page. Okay, it's an iPad. So I'll begin with the relevant quote from Bergson. And in it, please note his valuations of disability and his urging for non-reflection in the viewer. Is it not then the case that the hunchback suggests the appearance of a person who holds himself badly? His back seems to have contracted an ugly stoop by a kind of physical obstinacy, by rigidity. In a word, it persists in the habit it has contracted. Try to see with your eyes alone. Avoid reflection, and above all, do not reason. Abandon all your prepossessions. Seek to recapture a fresh, direct, and primate impression. The vision you reacquire will be one of this kind. You will have before you a man bent on cultivating a certain rigid attitude, whose body, if one may use the expression, is one vast grin. Bergson's musings about the disabled embodiment of a so-called hunchback at first seem to have to do little to do with the questions that I opened with, and yet they propose an intriguing set of theatrical conditions about durability, disabled being, and response. In particular, habitual or sedimented contraction, rigid attitude, physical obstinacy, and in this case, the primally unreflectedly comic. There are connections between disability and raciality that I want to draw here, and they are complex and can feel risky to those who are doing this kind of work. But the didactic givens of what is understood as disability and what is understood as race have long been, I think, interwoven, interconstituted, and even the ways in which they have been made to mark out segregated space is a kind of history of violence. That his work in race and disability has helped to demonstrate that racism has worked in part through the material and notional imposition of disability, and disability in itself has worked in part through the material and notional imposition of race. I want to outline ways in which agitation is already present here as an idea, perhaps as a biopolitical idea related to self-conduct, one that pops up in disparate spaces in this contemporary moment. Emotion has been described as an agitation of the soul, which can itself be counterposed to notions of cultivation, such as in Bergson's gesturally controlled comic. At the same time, some versions of agitation have the appearance of gestural repetition, suggesting to some observers the machinic over the natural. The term agitation has broad use and broad range of value, crossing such domains as medical pharmacology, securitized educational and child developmental spheres, and political movements where it is seen as a fundament of revolution. Agitation appears regularly in dramatic stories of drug scourges in the United States and elsewhere, which may not be unrelated to the fervor for cultures of resistive contamination seen in contemporary zombie shows. Most importantly, however, by its simplest definition, it is a part of everyday life and everyday movement for a diverse number of people, some of whom identify as disabled, others of whom do not. And I pay little heed here to formal definitions of disability precisely because too much can escape the kind of bureaucratized categories of disability. Does the term's non-metaphorical reach across pharmacology and political movements alike signal a relation other than just coincidence or homonymy? I think there are connections in practice. And so I'll try to lay some grounds for those impressions. And I think this disciplinary encounter that I'm trying to stage could be described as one ranging between gesture studies, critical race theory, medical humanities, and disability studies. But this is I'm being very modest about this since I'm coming at gesture from a combination of linguistics and thinking about animacy, rather than dance, theater, or performance studies. But I really hope to at least humbly compliment the beautiful work that we saw when arriving midday yesterday. And I am so sorry to have missed Erin Manning's talk, which might have been very informative for me today. And I also found myself reflecting a great deal on the dance in both Wu Tang and Lihia Lewis's films. I want also to pull away towards some spaces that might seem further afield in this talk, and then come back and then see what emerges. So in the medical sciences, which I should say have a troubled status for disability communities, in part for their often violent motive to always correct and cure, if not kill, the idea of agitation is actually broadly operative in manuals of toxicology, psychiatry, and pharmaceutical reference. In these contexts, the term commonly refers to psychomotor or neuromuscular movement. So you have phrases like excessive motor activity associated with a feeling of inner tension, whether or not influenced by external stimuli. And this phrasing you will find in the 5th Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders in the States. One form of agitation, muscular spasms, can result from either, quote, mental disturbance or nerve stimulation. The term also arises in the discussion of various stimulatory substances, and so in pharmaceutical reference, it can be a sign that a drug is not well tolerated. Its mention is opposed to the calmer patterns resulting from another set of drugs, such as sedatives. So in the most general sense, agitation has been something to treat or suppress from the point of view of a system of control, with the exception of those transitional exacerbations that might be anticipated in some kinds of medical treatment. As we know, the medical industry creatively generates its own continuation. This is a constitutive problem that receives much due criticism. And yet, I also want to note that it can sometimes offer genuine relief. In some therapeutic use, muscle relaxants can be prescribed to alleviate the constant muscle tension characteristic of many forms of cerebral palsy. In other medical foci, the gendered pathology of hysteria, of course, was defined symptomatically in terms of agitation of mind and body, and both condition and symptom were subject to correction. And finally, psychiatric survivor and scholar Eric Fabris has written of a form of mandated chemical restraint using largely sedating and constraining substances like haloperidol, used to treat such diverse conditions as psychosis and Tourette's syndrome, of psychiatric outpatients under community treatment orders in an era of post-1950s deinstitutionalizations in neoliberalizing North America. So they were released from prison, but in order to comply with that release, they were required to take certain kinds of sedatives. Chemical restraint is indeed intended to suppress agitation, which Fabris reads as a pointer to the stereotype of the aggressive patient. And yet within this privatized, distributed kind of institution, there is no more than, for him, a hazy line that separates agitation from illness and drugging from treatment. So while the widespread medicalization of cultural fields extends the meaning of patient, the discourses of security also expand the potential gestural field for what is called aggression. Indeed, the apparently aggressive actions are those most obviously tied to the case for violent suppression, to the point of intentional killing by state or security agents. And most palpable today are the continuing sequence of viewable black deaths at the hands of police, and the repetitive police defenses narrating their perception of dangerous black movement in an era in which readily available social media and cameras have yielded a sense of immediacy, even if these deaths have been ongoing. We can note a fluid and overlapping, sometimes interdependent interplay between what Fabris calls chemical incarceration and the state murder of people of color and people with mental illness. Looking across another cultural domain that has undergone significant medicalization, childhood. Agitation is also used to describe the states of youth who evince disciplinary disturbance in schools or who are disruptive at home. In one simplified account of the racial orders of education, where children of color who have not been diagnosed with disability show agitation, responses align with the punishment of an intending perpetrator. And where white children evince agitation, responses open more generously toward the diagnostic, the assignation of a state of being moved by a pathological agent called autism. Last but not least, agitation has a history as a political term referring to actively opposing dominant forces and supporting change, or the collective shaping of dissent. So for instance, Russian revolutionaries led by Lenin considered agitation to be a key focal and inciting revolutionary tactic, to operate in partnership with propaganda. On the other hand, agitation has not always been used according to surface expectation, and so we can see hints of the fascist exploitation of agitation strategies in the contemporary US, where the Trump administration is using the illusion to affect the masses. If excessive motor activity associated with inner tension does not immediately correlate to the incitement to revolutionary action, there's nevertheless within both a sense of a relationship between action and actional potential. What links these approaches and subsumes potential, and which I'll explore in the following minutes, is a question of gesture. Gesture defined as movement that doubles as articulatory animation, though without necessary attachments to clear evidence of, for instance, non-disabled human intention or agency. Indeed, the notion of articulation itself includes all of the senses of expression, growth, and arrangement. So this definition may seem to oppose the expressive exercise of political agency that is understood as some forms of conscious agitation, including, we could think of the sort of the planned muscularity of street protest gestures, right? But the diversity of many gestural ways of embodied living makes such an opening necessary. And so what strikes me as a critical mechanism for securities theater is the line between intention and non-intention, responsibility and non-responsibility, the uncertain expectation that a gesture be expressive. Of course, do security agents look for expression or for behavior? So following critiques of humanist modes of inquiry, I want to consider gesture here as more and less than the simplest ideal of humanist agency. And I'm interested in this question not because I want to, referring back to what Jack was moving toward in the opening comments, I'm not trying to reassert the presence of humanness or agency in certain scenes, although that work can be very important and is done, of course, but to be able to point out the complicity of dubious agency in the formulations of racist securitization. The determinacy of life and death in the realm of animacy are very much conditioned by other factors. Who in a given instance is understood as being animated or de-animated, or animated by disability or disabled intoxication, or by monstrosity, and how? What will be done with that animation? Though etymological compendia don't have all the explanatory powers they have occasionally been accorded in humanities scholarship, the historical span they record can still be instructive. So for instance, the Oxford English Dictionary's first definition for gesture, etymologically derived of Latin nominalized gerere, to carry, is manner of carrying the body, bearing, carriage, deportment, implying an agent with physical control. Agitation, however, has a mixed etymology of activity-passivity that includes both Middle French, state or condition of being moved to and fro, public disturbance or unrest, action of shaking, and classical Latin, violent moving, brandishing, shaking, disturbance, movement, practice or exercise, mental activity. So each etymological contribution alone suggests that agitation is only the latest concretization of an even longer conceptual tangle between such now distant entities as mental activity and violent moving or shaking and public unrest. By comparison, consider Adriana Carrero's tracing of terror to the Latin root ter, trembling, and a verb relating to fear as a physical state. In Carrero's analysis, the trembling movements attributed to fear and the flight attributed to fear are both etymologically linked to modern-day terror. As she writes, there's an instinctual mobility associated with the ambit of terror, which not only replicates the etymological ambiguity of action for agitation, but also suggests its own modulating temporal scope. My ongoing interest in animacy requires a careful look at such unsurprisingly blurred agency to ask about assignations of humanity, an agency that cluster around certain human or inhuman entities, such that only some, for instance, seem to be afforded a theory of mind. Of course, simply by juxtaposing agitation and gesture, I'm aware of the possibility for, again, Jack, hopefully productive confusion. The question of uncertainly sourced agitation, I think, interrupts the question of agentive gesture. So why care about this? Okay, I'm still figuring this out, but I'm seeing a consolidation of security and medicalizing discourses around the racialization of disability and the disabilization of race, two things ever, again, materially entangled, that end up staging, animating, as it were, something like agitation in ways that simultaneously deny and sublimate its own history as linked to resistance and or chemical exposure, while failing to acknowledge the history of performance and gesture and indeed embodiment as one of undeniable and irreducible experiment constantly crossing the shifting lines of ability, debility, and disability. I found it useful to think with the idea of racialized ability tuning, a form of disability or difference-soaked embodiment or a kind of gestural containment to which all are subject and whose entrainments can be biopolitically managed. Within this scenario, biochemistry and its agencies can be counted as active on the scene. Debilities and their agencies can also be counted as actively on the scene. We could imagine resistive agency as an immanent feature of Foucauldian power. Where there is power, there's agitation. But regardless of the chosen analytic, there are specific dimensions that I think are further deserving of discussion, such as ways to locate arguably less expressive forms of gestural resistance and to revive discourses that allow for the participation of chemical histories of environmental injustice in a scene of apparently different kinds of violence. So in my consideration of the racial disabled theater of security, I find Bergson's treatment a fitting occasion to ask further questions. What becomes of the theatrical semi-stage or non-stage, the failures of legibility of the comic, the persistence of racialized, abled, classed, gendered bodies who are too negligently characterized by a, quote, deep-seated recalcitrance of matter, or the implicit felicities that make successful Bergson's form of comic encountered, as he thinks, readily enough in everyday life. Here is a range of possible discussion about the performative objecthood of Black and other non-white bodies, richly discussed by Saidiya Hartman and currently being imagined in a range of ways in the work of people like Tavia Nyong'o, Yuri McMillan, Zakiya Jackson, Chen, Juana Maria Rodriguez, Eunjung Kim, and others in a number of transnational sites. Using the figure of the avatar to read Black women's deployments of self-objecthood, Yuri McMillan identifies the explicit presence of disability in a number of gestures and prosthetic objects, such as poultice treatments, that indexed the white avatar of a woman named Ellen Craft during her escape from slavery. McMillan's analysis pointedly announces disability, and in so doing implicitly names the bifurcation between the structural privileging of disability over debility that in its simpler versions mirrors a racial divide, one, a flag toward consideration and acknowledgement of whiteness, much like what Tobin Siebers might describe as disability masquerade, right? These are sort of the broken parts. I'm sort of hearing your previous talk as well. The undersides of things that carry normative valuation, right? One on the side of disability masquerade, the other toward the biopolitical zone of vital abandonment. But what Macmillan makes additionally clear is the whiteness of this symbolic potency, its power to cultivate concerted actions of helpful civil society that enable rather than curtail passing, and perhaps also fugitivity. In Laughter, Bergson identifies the participation of inhuman and human in the sharp affectivity of an apparent lapse of the agentive, yielding to the mechanical, the rigid, the matter within, and thus for him enabling comic reception. But to depart from the proper scope of his essay and the craft he attributes to that comic performance, we know that that point of affective intensity at the gap of agency does not only yield laughter. As I suggested earlier, the scripts for gestural conduct are and have been racialized. So I'm interested in how race, disability, and performance are made to work together in the everyday, and I find this concert itself to be troublingly generative. This is the unmarked everywhere of disability, disablement, debility, and occasional impairment. This contemporary situation in which so many people are, if not categorically disabled, then perhaps in intimately tuned relationships with chemicals, exogenous ones or endogenous ones, whose management in the body can be temporarily altering and temporarily impairing or disabling. But of these people, some number are further exposed to destruction, not because of, but in conjunction with them. I emphasize in conjunction with because this is not a question of causality. The pervasiveness of these chemical encounters present other gaps to explore that represent something of a departure from that virtuosically agentive performance, if we were to consider the possible legacy of that Middle French etymological contributor to agitation, being moved. To examine Bergson's opening quote and the logic of his exemplar more closely, this comic scene, whose baldness relies upon a primate lack of language or cognition, right? Only the visual register is allowed, above all, do not reason, relies on the apprehension of disability in the form of Bergson's Hunchback. It's a particular form of comedy, since not only does it rely on a relationship of the spectacle, but its reaction borrows on the structure of othering. So one can see traces of Raymond Williams' survey of intentional and extensional meanings of culture as drawing on both cultivation and civilization. The function of removing cognition for Bergson is to de- and retemporalize the form before the observer. From his back seems to have contracted an ugly stoop, and it persists in the habit it has contracted. One moves to, you will have before you a man bent on cultivating a certain rigid attitude. So that consolidation of sedimented time with gradual effects on the body to a moment where that sedimented attitude is presented as presentist attitude transfers the articulation as growth to the articulation as expression, and so doing remaps perceived time. This telling may be too constrained for Bergson's purposes. As Rebecca Schneider observes of the striking of a pose within the flow of time, a pose is a posture, a stance struck in reiterative gesture, often signifying precedent. Yet a consideration of the temporalities of disability invoked here, rather than an invocation simply of the machinic, puts an interesting pressure on the labilities of time in the reception of this moment. At the same moment, the man's body becomes another attitude altogether, that prescriptive attitude of the observer, one vast grin. And in cognition's absence, the agency of the back and its habitual contraction have become the ugly willfulness of the man. Bergson suggests here that the grinning charge of affect, temporalized and perhaps intensified, becomes transferable, shareable, or blurred, a formal kind of sympathy between observed and observer. And here's where this question of vibration might become something of the sharing between bodies. Furthermore, the attribution of disability understood as an accreted condition of non-agency becomes inchoate. The audience may no longer have to be seen as reactively laughing at the disabled man, even if one had to understand the idea of the disabled man in order to laugh. The stooped man alone, the comic, is responsible for making a mockery of the non-agency of the disabled, the fall. And sympathy runs between the comic and the audience, but not the hunchback. What if the reflexive laughing were instead a reflexive act of condemnation? So by way of demonstrating the consolidation or attenuation of difference, consider some different scenes. The first is asks of the reader an extended time in which to imagine the reflex. A young white male, Brock Turner, in Stanford, California, was witnessed raping an unconscious woman in January 2015. He turned out to be drunk. 1 year later at trial, he was given a light sentence precisely because, to quote Judge Aaron Persky, quote, "It's not an excuse, but his intoxication is a factor that, when trying to assess moral culpability in this situation, is mitigating. There's less moral culpability attached to the defendant who is legally intoxicated." So the legal definition of intoxication served as exculpatory in Turner's case. Turner was so moved by intoxication, and the result was an evacuation of responsibility. The judge could not condemn, but laughing might have been more possible. Turner and his actions had effectively made a mockery of durative intoxication, perhaps even of cognitive disability, but in the theater of security, he was not so responsible. So if the judge were to have scanned possibilities of disability, no comparator was found. Corinne Gaines, a Maryland resident and a young black woman, filed a lawsuit in 2012 against 2 Baltimore landlords, alleging the apartments had a sea of lead, which was linked in her suit to neurodevelopmental disabilities or injuries. Unlike many lead toxicity claims that tend to be on behalf of vulnerable children, she was an adult justifying her claim to that vulnerability, suggesting she had a high level of expertise about lead toxicity and exercised her agency in assigning responsibility to her landlords for environmental harm. Gaines connected her claim to her diagnosis of neurocognitive impairment and her history of agitation and mood swings. 4 years later, as some of you know, on August 1, 2016, in Randallsville, Maryland, Corinne Gaines was shot and killed inside her apartment by police after hours of standoff with guns pointed from both sides. While the drama of the case focused on her own provocative use of firearms, her killing by police and her status as a mother, the existence of a lawsuit 4 years earlier suggests a much longer history of consciously embodied living as someone who understood herself as having been significantly affected by lead exposure. Unlike some intoxications, this chemical modulation was clearly one she had not desired, and going at least as far as the juridical domain had attempted to remedy. Hers is a history of durative intoxication that, rather than working as a kind of attenuated responsibility, functioned as an aggressive debility. An era of chemical experimentation that is the stuff of medicine, consumer culture, built environments, and industrial commodity policy is equally an area of bodily experimentation. In a gestural world already conditioned by unpredictability, what bodies will be made to pay doubly for that experimentation? And in these contexts, what becomes of, quote, unruly, unrestful conduct, bodily agitation? So I want to take agitation seriously, not only as an ensemble of gestural cultures of non-disabled expression or choreographed resistance, but also the movement vocabularies of people living with diverse bodily experiences, again, explicitly including disabled people, as well as with bodily intolerances, such as intoxications, actively collapsing these segregated domains that agitation has come to occupy, but of course not under the sign of any one of them. They are not one and the same. This is a broad sweep, but I find it useful to think with an open sense of what might be defined as bodily intolerance, especially as I want to suspend judgment. Consider the expression, "there's only so much you can take," could refer equally to the forced tolerance of environmentally inequitable ingestion and to the forced embodiment of docility, non-insurgency. And so it's relevant to consider what Jonathan Metzl describes in Protest Psychosis about a mid-20th century clinic in Michigan that certain Black patients, quote, agitations, were motivated not so much by distinguishable illness, although they named a new form of schizophrenia on this basis, but a performance of an idea for them of Black pathology, part of a pattern of an attachment of African American bodies to specific nominal pathologies. Metzl notes that advertisements for the antipsychotic sedative Thorazine in the 70s referred to Africanized figurations of the unruly primitive. And we also learn from Alondra Nelson how the Black Panthers actively contested the growing biologization of violence, the entrapments of medicalized pathology. So from another angle, Derek Scott explores in Frantz Fanon's Wretched of the Earth a repeating metaphor of muscular tension felt by Algerian colonial subjects of living under conditions of domination. Through the analysis, Scott insists on tension's purely metaphoric value for Fanon as a psychic element, pointing in spite of itself to powers in the midst of debility. Scott writes, muscle tension is the state of flexure that has the appearance of movement but is in substance barely moving and static in a state of attenuated atrophy. Wanting to ask questions of embodiment that Scott did not, I do wonder about these links between tension and agitation, one as the condition for the other, or where tension is the condition shared between a sedimented rigidity and the movement that is then dubbed as insurgency. In the contemporary animation of security, there seem to be two modes of inhumanism, what we could call inhumanism. One seems to work along the lines of abilities consolidation with agency, intoxication, the workings of a inhuman chemical inside or through you. Bergson's mechanical encrusted upon the living. This second, raciality, runs through the first mode, but also contributes to delineated gestural economies. These work together such that on the one hand, there exists a category perhaps of the gestural mundanity of whites, or to refer to Bergson's comic, a kind of white slapstick broadly construed without durative effect, which bears a history of the autonomic, the mechanical, the supersession of human agency. And on the other hand, the gestural monstrosity of others, which bears its own history of the autonomic, the mechanical, and the absence of human agency. I contend that these bifurcations of agitative motion feed into contemporary security states in ways that, given their histories, are maybe unsurprising to historians of gesture, but also, of course, unsurprising to communities and individuals who are forced to engage in this kind of gestural racialized entrainment. Okay, I'm running out of time, so I'm going to give you my last paragraph, if I might. Can I? In this new midst, what to do again with Bergson's urging for the reactive spectacle, for an enhanced strength of example? Try to see with your eyes alone, abandon all, avoid reflection, and above all, do not reason. Abandon all your prepossessions, seek to recapture a fresh, direct, and primate impression. A Fanonian resistive muscular tension, agitation as its release or intensification, the tensions of some disabled movement, the trembling of intoxication. The geneses and timings are unambiguously different, yet their role in the theater of security inchoate and somehow distantly kin. And I wish, despite its seemingly relentless growth, to recall security as a hostile ghosting of old energies. Before this, we come to know, have known, agitation. Agitation confronted becomes a new demand to vibrate together in glory and exhaustion as a call to accentuated rhythmic being, not regulation. Agitation as a form of conduct, agitation as a form of living. Thank you.
Well, for someone who wasn't feeling well,
I got it out.
that was pretty heroic. because we're a little off on time. So I think we'll do 5 minutes and then immediately move to Jean. But so maybe if I ask one question and then we'll collect a couple of comments and then give you a chance to conclude. So I'm really struck by this idea of agitation, tension, and the shifting of scales between the individually shaking, vibrating body and then the political body that becomes agitated either on behalf of revolution or is worked by the forces of fascism towards agitation. So I wonder if you can maybe help us think about that jump in scale from the individual body to the political body on the one hand, and on the other hand, you know, some people might accomplish that, if you think of a sociologist like Deb Gould, by talking about a moving politics, a politics conducted through affect, but you don't go there. And I think that's super interesting. The bridge is not affect and is not the psychic. Right? You're not asking us to think about the body being moved as in an affective sense of being moved by emotion. This is another kind of moving. So what is it? How can we use this physical motion to make that jump?
Yes, you're right that I don't go through affect, and in part because I'm still mapping where I really want to use affect and where I think I might go at it a different way. I'm very interested in the animatedness of embodied being and what that might offer for exploration of other kinds of commonalities. There is a very kind of obvious staging of collectivities as an ensemble of individuals, and it's the kind of protest marches that we've been seeing, so frequently in the U.S. right now, that have a kind of shared set of movements, a shared set of tensions, embodied tensions, and even I think I would say a kind of shared muscularity, the quality of which I actually want to question, right? So I didn't really talk about muscle tension as a physical phenomenon, but what I was trying to do was open it up to all levels of strength, of control, of design, and rather have it be something that might not even be perceptible, right? As movement. And what that would do then to maybe the kind of collective fantasies of agitated, shared resistance in the form of certain kinds of marches.
So even thinking about the way in which we protest and the way we favor certain sets of gestures over others, for example.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, I can certainly speak from experience, and many of my peers and friends in disability community, these marches are not really meant for everyone. They are not, they are not a kind of one size fits all. And then the question is what to do about that, right? So if the urgency of certain kinds of violence in the States is calling for, it's seemingly calling for equal gestures of muscular resistance, then how do we actually think about the dramatic enfolding of disability within these cultures of resistance as a result precisely of forces of racism, class injustice, and so on? What would it mean to bring these fully together in terms of embodied being? And yes, maybe affect isn't the way to go there. I mean, I'm asking myself this,
I like that question. We maybe have time for one or two comments. Yes, Eliza, and then Erin.
Thank you so much, Mel.
Hey.
I wanted to ask about history, and I was really excited that you brought this Bergson reading on laughter. And I wanted to ask about the deposit of affect, as what he talks about, the incrustation. And I just want to maybe ask if you could elaborate where does history come into this analysis that you're offering that, for instance, you used words like ghosting and that kind of lingering. And of course, performance requires a repertoire and repetition. So I'm just wondering about that piece of what you've offered. Thank you.
I mean, good question. I don't know if I have an answer for you. I will share that I'm in this larger project looking at a couple of 19th century scenarios that brought together questions of chemical being in terms of opium, forms of incarceration, and anti-indigenous legislation in 2 different sites. So I'm having to think about history in ways that I have not been. I will also say that I'm resolutely not a historian, and I'm okay with that. So in other words, I don't use, I think, traditional historical methods to get at these questions, in part because I'm very interested in the kind of trans-temporal resonances that I would permit, but that a historian might not. So anyway, let's talk more about these questions.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Such extraordinary work. It's really more of a comment, but also a long conversation. Over the last years, I've been very involved in who is excluded from the university, as well as who is excluded from the protest world, right? I think about both, and the people I most collaborate with are excluded precisely because of their agitation, because their bodies don't read as capable of learning. And so there's a really strong piece between what we recognize as intelligence and what we recognize as docility. And so just a little anecdote, when we published, there's an amazing book that everybody should read by Melanie Yergo called Authoring Autism. It's just come out of Duke, and Melanie Yergo is special, and it's a sad specialness in that she's the first autistic to have a book in an academic press. And in the book, what Melanie's getting at is that her neurology excludes her from rhetoric. That the lack of volition in an agitating body precisely takes away your voice. And so in the book, she includes the stems of her agitation in her writing, but they get deleted by the reviewers. Who can't read them as intelligent. So I think there's, anyway, I'm just really appreciating that, because if we don't let the agitation in our writing, we won't change anything. So
Absolutely. Thank you. And I guess we have many longer conversations to have, because in some renderings of this kind of this project, I find myself always returning to the space in which everyone is sitting and just asking this pointing out this really shocking, I'm glad it's shocking me each time, which is so many people who aren't here, right? And those who are here might not be here with ease. And furthermore, there is a kind of conspiracy to perform a kind of embodied being that actually has a deep impact on the kinds of work we produce, right? And I want, with you and others, to think together within and without disability studies, to think together about how all of these things have gone wrong and how we can change the academy to something that we want to be in, right?
Great. Well, I think today's and yesterday's and the whole week is hopefully working on behalf of that project. Can we please thank Mel Chen?